She was sleeping in the church when he found her. He said, "There's a bed at my place." Abel Strickland found the woman at 6:30 on a Sunday morning, curled on the back pew of the Piney Fork church, with her coat folded under her head and her shoes lined up neatly on the floor beside her. He had come to fix the hinge on the vestry door, a job the pastor had asked him about 3 times, and he had not expected to find anyone inside. The church was unlocked because the pastor believed in unlocked churches, a conviction that Abel privately considered optimistic for a mining town. Abel was not a man given to sentiment. He measured things, boards, angles, distances, and he trusted measurements more than feelings. But something about the way the morning light fell through the window glass and touched the sleeping woman's face made him set the toolbox down more gently than he otherwise would have. He stood in the aisle with his toolbox and looked at the woman. She was thin, the kind of thin that comes from weeks, not days, of not eating enough. Her dress was patched at the elbows, and the hem was frayed to threads. Her hair was dark and tangled, and her face, even in sleep, carried the tight expression of someone who had been bracing against something for a long time. She was young, maybe 22 or 23, and she was shivering because the church had no stove, and the April nights in the Colorado mountains still carried the memory of winter. Her hands were tucked under her chin, the fingers curled inward like something trying to protect itself. Beside the shoes, a small cloth bundle held what looked like a comb and a piece of soap. The neatness struck him, the shoes aligned, the coat folded square, the bundle placed just so. She had nothing, but what she had was organized. That said something about a person, Abel thought. It said she had not given up. Abel set down his toolbox quietly and went back outside. He stood on the church steps and considered his options. He could fix the hinge and leave. He could wake her and ask her business. He could tell the pastor, who would organize something charitable and slow and well-meaning. He went back inside and sat down in the pew across the aisle and waited for her to wake up. Her name was Lottie Crane. She told him this after she startled awake and pressed herself against the wall of the pew, her eyes wide and her hands flat against the wood, as though she were preparing to run. Abel told her his name, and that he was the carpenter, and that he had come to fix a hinge, and that she did not need to be afraid of him. "I am not afraid," she said, which was a lie they both recognized. She had come to Piney Fork 3 weeks ago, following a letter from a cousin who had promised her work at the boarding house. The cousin had moved on before Lottie arrived, and the boarding house had no position open, and Lottie had spent the 3 weeks since then doing laundry and mending for whoever would pay, which was not many people. She had been sleeping in the church for 4 nights, coming in after dark and leaving before dawn, and she had been eating whatever she could afford, which by now was almost nothing. She told it all without self-pity, as though she were reporting on someone else's troubles. Her voice was flat and careful, and her hands stayed folded in her lap, and she did not look at him while she spoke. Abel recognized the tone. It was the tone of a person who had asked for help before and learned that the asking was usually worse than the need. Abel listened to all of this without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "There is a bed at my place, a proper one, in a room with a door that locks from the inside. You can use it until you figure out what comes next." Lottie looked at him the way she had looked at everything since arriving in Piney Fork, with the careful evaluation of a woman who had learned that offers usually came with conditions. "What do you want for it?" she asked. "Nothing. People do not give things for nothing." "Some do. I am one of them." Abel Strickland was 34 years old, built like the timber he worked with. Solid, square, put together for durability rather than show. He had been in Piney Fork for 6 years, running a carpentry shop on the east end of Main Street. He built furniture and cabinets and coffins and whatever else the town needed. And he did it well, and he lived alone in the 4-room house behind the shop, because the woman he had been engaged to in Kansas had married someone else while he was building a life for her out west. He did not talk about this. He rarely talked about anything personal, but he was known in Piney Fork as a man who did what he said he would do, which was a reputation worth more than eloquence. Lottie came to the house that morning and Abel showed her the spare room, which was small and plain and contained a bed, a washstand, and a hook for her coat. He showed her where the kitchen was and told her to eat whatever she found. Then he went to the church and fixed the vestry hinge and came back 2 hours later to find the kitchen cleaner than it had been in a year, a pot of beans on the stove, and Lottie sitting at the table mending one of his shirts that she had found in the basket he kept meaning to get to. "You do not have to work for the room," he said. "I am not working for the room," she said. "I am working because sitting still makes me feel like I am drowning." He understood that. He had felt the same way after Clara's letter came from Kansas, the one that explained with careful kindness that she had met someone closer to home and hoped he would understand. He had built 3 cabinets that week, working until his hands cracked and bled, because the alternative was sitting still and thinking about it. The following days established a pattern that was awkward at first, and then, gradually, as natural as breathing. Lottie was up before dawn each morning, moving quietly in the kitchen, and Abel lay in his bed in the next room, listening to the sounds of another person in his house, the scrape of the stove door, the clatter of the coffee pot, the soft pad of her feet on the floorboards. These sounds, which should have been intrusions, felt instead like something missing had been returned. He gave her space, and she gave him the same, and they orbited each other like 2 planets that had not yet worked out whether they shared the same gravity. Lottie stayed. She took over the kitchen entirely, not because Abel asked her to, but because cooking was the one skill she had that produced immediate, visible results. She was good at it, better than good. She could make a meal from almost nothing, stretching ingredients the way only someone who had been hungry knows how. Abel came home from the shop each evening to food that was simple and hot, and made with a care that went beyond mere competence. He told her once that she cooked the way he built furniture, with attention to the joins. She almost smiled at that. It was the closest she had come to smiling since he had known her, and it changed her face entirely. The town noticed, because the town always noticed. Abel Strickland, the quiet carpenter who had lived alone for 6 years, now had a woman in his house who was not his wife and not his kin. Mrs. Pitt at the general store asked pointed questions. Reverend Loomis expressed pastoral concern. The miners' wives exchanged glances over the counter at the dry goods. Abel endured all of this with the patience of a man who had spent his life working with difficult materials. "People are talking," Lottie said one evening. They were sitting on the porch, which Abel had built wide enough for 2 chairs, because he had always hoped for a reason to need the second one. "People talk," Abel said. "It is what they do when they have no furniture to build." "It does not bother you? Does it bother you?" She considered this. "It used to. When I first came here, every whisper felt like a stone. Now it feels more like rain. I know it is there, but it does not reach me the way it did." Abel looked at her. The lamplight from the window caught the side of her face, and he thought she looked less thin than she had a month ago, less tight in the jaw, less braced. She looked like someone who was beginning to believe that the ground under her feet might hold. "Good," he said. As the weeks passed, Lottie began to find her way into the town's economy. She started taking in mending again, but now she had an address and a reputation and a table to work at, and the work came steadily. She mended shirts and trousers and dresses, and she was fast and precise, and soon she had more work than she could do in a day. She bought fabric from Mrs. Pitt's store and made a dress for herself, the first new dress she had owned in 2 years, and when she wore it to church on Sunday morning, Abel noticed that she walked differently, straighter, as though the dress had given her back a piece of herself she had misplaced. Abel built her a sewing table. He did not tell her he was building it. He worked on it in the shop after hours, choosing the best walnut he had, joining it with the same care he gave to the pieces people paid for. He fitted it with a drawer for her thread and scissors, and a shelf underneath for fabric. He carried it to the spare room while she was out delivering a mended dress, and when she came home and found it, she stood in the doorway of her room and pressed her hand over her mouth and did not speak for a long time. "You built this," she said. "I am a carpenter. It is what I do. You built this for me." "Yes." She looked at him, and something in her expression broke open, not in a way that was painful, but in the way a seed breaks open when it is ready to grow. She crossed the room and put her arms around him. And Abel stood very still, because he had not been touched in 6 years, and he had forgotten how much it could mean. She was trembling, not from cold this time, but from something she had held inside for so long that letting it go felt dangerous. Abel could feel it in the way she gripped the back of his shirt, as though she were holding on to something she was afraid would be taken away. "No one has ever built me anything," she said against his shoulder. Her voice was muffled and thick. "Not once in my whole life. Not a shelf, not a stool, not anything." "Then people have not been paying attention," Abel said. She laughed, a broken, wet sound that was half sob, and pulled back far enough to look at his face. Her eyes were red, and her nose was running, and she was more beautiful than anything he had ever built. "Thank you," she said. He put his arms around her carefully, the way he handled fragile wood, and held her, and the house that had been quiet for 6 years filled with a sound he could not hear but could feel, the sound of something beginning. They did not rush. They had both been hurt by expectation, and they were careful with each other in the way that only damaged people can be careful. But the house shifted around them, the way a building shifts when it settles into its foundation. Lottie moved her sewing into the main room where the light was better, and Abel built a second chair for the porch because the first one now always had someone in it, and they ate supper together every evening and talked about the day the way people do when the day is shared. One evening in late July, a knock came at the door. It was Mrs. Gatley, the midwife, carrying a basket of preserves and a look of determination. "I have come to apologize," Mrs. Gatley said, addressing Lottie. "I should have come sooner. I should have come the first week you were in town. We all should have." Lottie took the basket and looked at the jars of blackberry preserves and the cloth napkin folded on top and the woman who had brought them. "Come in," Lottie said. "The coffee is still hot." Mrs. Gatley stayed an hour, and when she left, she told 3 other women what she had learned, that Lottie Crane was not the desperate, scheming woman the gossip had imagined, but a seamstress with steady hands, and a laugh that came out like a surprise, and that Abel Strickland was the happiest she had ever seen him, and that some things in Piney Fork were exactly as they should be. In August, Abel asked her to marry him. He did it in the shop, surrounded by sawdust and half-finished chairs, because that was where he was most himself. He said he did not have much to offer beyond a house and a trade, and a disposition that was more reliable than exciting, and that he understood if she wanted more than that. He had practiced what he was going to say for 3 days, shaping the words the way he shaped dovetail joints, carefully, precisely, testing the fit before committing. But standing there with the sawdust on his apron and the late afternoon light coming through the shop window, the practiced words fell away, and he said what was true instead. "I was alone for 6 years," he said, "and I thought I was all right with it. I thought a man could fill his life with work, and that would be enough. Then you walked into my kitchen and cleaned it and cooked beans, and I realized that I had not been all right. I had just been waiting." Lottie's eyes filled, and she pressed her lips together the way she did when she was trying to hold something in. Lottie looked at the sawdust on his hands, and the shavings in his hair, and the honest, undecorated face of the man who had found her sleeping in a church and brought her home without asking for anything. "I have spent my entire life wanting more," she said, "and more never came. You came, that is enough." They were married by Reverend Loomis in September, in the church where Abel had found her. The pew where she had slept was decorated with wildflowers, and Mrs. Pitt, who had asked all those pointed questions, cried into her handkerchief and said she had known all along it would turn out this way, which was not remotely true, but was kind enough that no one corrected her. Abel built a cradle that winter, from the same walnut he had used for the sewing table, and set it in the corner of their bedroom where the morning light came in. Lottie ran her hand along the smooth wood and looked at her husband, and he looked back at her, and neither of them spoke, because some things do not need words to be said. The woman who had been sleeping in a church had found a bed, and a table, and a man who built things that lasted.